So now I'm going to turn to the two people who I think could interview 17th century Ottoman Muslims in some way.
Trying.
They're trying. They're quite good at it. Cemal Kafadar, Baby Koç Professor of Turkish Studies here at Harvard University, with whom Shahab always wanted to co-teach a course on what he had not yet articulated as the Balkans to Bengal complex, and who I'm very fortunate to have as my PhD advisor, will speak to us from the field of history. After Bu, Necipolu Algaphan Professor of Islamic Art here at Harvard, and the person with whom Shahab used to say he wanted to go back and do a second doctorate in the history of art and architecture, will speak to us from precisely that field.
Thank you, Nora, for organizing this, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for being today. On the first two speakers, not at the end, I'll come to it. But, let me begin by saying what probably is obvious to everyone, that Shahab's work is profoundly historical. And that cannot be easily said about much of the literature in Islamic studies or in the study of religion, the academic categories with which he and his work are often affiliated. And this is not a matter of his legendary appetite for reading broadly and thus including more than the usual of the work of historians, but a matter of his historicizing rigor in thinking about Islam. In fact, he refers to his forthcoming book, The Problem of the Satanic Verses and the Formation of Islamic Orthodoxy, as, I quote, my own work as a historian. I was very happy to read. In pointing out that the presence of an orthodoxizing trajectory in Islamic history is undeniable. He points to that work to make the point that he is not denying the point, denying the argument made by many that there has been a very crucial, very important orthodoxizing trajectory in Islamic history. Shahab is not out to do that and points to that forthcoming book of his. And to deny it, he says, would be absurd in view of his own work. Rather, he wishes to caution against the analytical consequences of the tendency to overemphasize prescription and orthodoxy in the conceptualization of Islam. He starts the book by identifying a dramatic reduction, and here I cite Eng Sang-ho, the anthropologist who couldn't be with us but sent a text which we don't have time to read to you, alas, but I'll just insert two of his sentences and say hello to him because we're being videotaped. So, his book, Shahab's book, he starts by identifying a dramatic reduction in what is today thought to properly constitute Islam, namely law and personal faith. As others have already pointed out, Shahab's Lebenswerk is his work on the Satanic Verses, which is a giant project to bring the story from the 2nd to the 15th century of the Islamic calendar, and in doing so, to delineate the construction of the prescriptive, orthodoxizing, normative framework that many eventually came to recognize as what Islam essentially was and is. Eng Sang writes, I felt sorry for him laboring under the great burden. He created a giant of an opponent and then had to make himself worthy of it. But boy, did he make himself worthy of it. And even seems to have had great fun doing it, whatever the sense of burden that inevitably accompanied such a Herculean task. Any conceptualization of a historical phenomenon in its own prescriptive and normative terms of self-representation is obviously going to make a historicizing mind restless. What did all those Muslims who did not follow or consciously transgress the norms and prescriptions think they were doing? What about those who may have been innocent of institutions of learning and law, but considered themselves Muslims? Were they unaware of norms? But how can the highly educated elites among them of the many cosmopolitan, urban, institution-laden societies of Islam in history, how can the highly educated elites, and that is where Shahab's attention is mostly focused, though he does make a social historical argument that what he says about the elites matters for the whole of Islamic society. How can those highly educated elites, some of them the very guardians of the law themselves, have been unaware of what they were doing? There's the story of an Ottoman judge, whom I didn't interview but came close, from the 15th century, who was well known for his indulgence in drinking wine. And at some point, he was appointed the Qadi, the judge of Galata, the part of Istanbul well known since the 15th century for its pubs and taverns. And around the same time, he heard that a frontier commander out there in the Balkans someplace was given the order that he should not act as frontier commanders do, but obey the new treaty signed between the Ottomans and Habsburgs and keep quiet. So the Qadi, who was appointed to Galata, said, this is like to appoint him at the frontier and to tell him not to act is like giving me the Qadiship of Galata, which they have done, and asking me not to drink wine. They knew what they were doing. And they had no qualms about their identity as Muslims at the same time. This is the dilemma, this is the contradiction, if you will, from some points of view at least, that Shahab is trying to understand and incorporate or even make an essential part of his conceptualization of what Islam is and has been. They considered the seductively disworldly and seemingly, at least seemingly transgressive aspects of the poetry of Hafiz, for instance, a key figure in Shahab's book, and one's familiarity and engagement with Hafiz's Divan, an obvious, perhaps even necessary aspect of being an educated Muslim. How so? Can these contradictions have been the very stuff of being Muslim, of Islam as they understood it and as we too should? Perhaps the most significant step, and for the future of historical research, the most consequential step Shahab takes to respond to these questions is to decenter the narrative of Islam, to re-spatialize it and re-territorialize it, which takes me to the B2B complex, Balkans to Bengal, which has already been dubbed, because we're going to say it again and again because it's such a cherished word already in terms of our analytical toolkit that we need a shorter form, B2B, Balkans to Bengal. For those of you who are coming maybe from Western or European history to this is somewhat like, though of a much greater scale, somewhat like the project that Natalie Zeman Davis had when she wrote the Decentering the Renaissance article, or when people have been questioning the periphery or even the whole geography of what it is that we now still study as the Enlightenment. For the purposes of this presentation, the book, Shahab's book, can be identified as a compelling invitation to historians to redirect their analytical and conceptual gaze from the so-called central lands of Islam in the Middle East and from the formative or early and classical period of Islamic history toward the B2B complex and what Shahab calls the post-formative period, which corresponds to what historians generally study as the late medieval and early modern periods, or to give it dates which Shahab provides, 1350 to 1850, of course, very roughly. This is obviously music to the ears of those of us who worked on the B2B world in those centuries, the gunpowder empires of Marshall Hodgson's, a word that did not, fortunately, make great headway. Among many other contributions of Marshall Hodgson, this one is not considered so successful. The Safavid, Ottoman, Mughal empires and their neighbors. So this is obviously music to our ears, but more than that, it is also a highly disruptive intervention in the long-reigning and prevalent paradigm of Islamic studies and Islamic history, which has grown accustomed to marginalize and ignore those other regions and periods. such as the Ottoman, such as the Mughal, such as the Safavid periods of the B2B complex. Now we, historians of those periods and times and places, have taken jibes in the direction of that kind of Islamic history. A critique of that kind of Islamic history is not necessarily new, but to take it on at both the conceptual and the historical scale that Shahab has presented as his project is really unprecedented, and I think a great opening for the future of historical research. Let us make sure that we do not reduce Shahab's argument to a mere call for inclusion, however. We have ignored them, so let us now include them. His point is much more revolutionary in terms of the principle, the original is the authentic. The principle in terms of his move is much more revolutionary in terms of shifting the paradigm in the conceptualization of Islam. I already gave it a summary form, but I'll come back to it. Those features and elements of the historical experiences of B2B Muslims that he highlights and delineates in the book, he asks his readers to recognize as integral to the meaningful conceptualization of Islam. It's not a matter of inclusion. It's an invitation to reconceptualize Islam by taking the B2B complex as an integral component of that reconceptualization. He asks his readers to recognize as integral to the meaningful conceptualization of Islam, as I said, the B2B complex, but not the only and sufficient conditions for conceptualizing Islam, but integral and absolutely necessary ones that have been marginalized and ignored, sometimes even explicitly belittled and written off, I might add. Just imagine all those non-Arab converts to Islam who for centuries lived and maybe even now live simply under the veneer of Islam, according to that historiography. The veneer of Islam, but actually self-deluding animists, mostly in Africa, and self-deluding shamanists, mostly Turkic and other Asian peoples. The principle, the original is the authentic, Shahab writes, bears a striking similarity to that of modern Salafism. So his enemy is much more than Salafism, modern or otherwise. It is that tradition of Islamic studies and sometimes Islamic self-representation which underlies the principle, the original is the authentic. The Muslims of the B2B were in no doubt as to the authenticity of their own complex and their own identity, Shahab pointed out again and again, and their contradictory post-formative modes of being Muslim. The B2B complex represents the most geographically, demographically, and temporally extensive instance of a highly articulated, shared paradigm of life and thought in the history of Muslims, and, if not the historically major paradigm of Islam. This, of course, is again a quote from Shahab's book. Or, again from him, when we think about what represents Islam, we tend not to think of Balkans to Bengal in the period 1350-1850. It is very much for this reason that I am taking the B2B complex as the primary socio-historical case in this book. It is at once a major and a dominant historical paradigm of Islam, but is largely unrecognized as such. The purpose then is to answer the question, what is Islam, by way of this B2B paradigm. In no way, he writes, to delegitimate the normative Islam of the paradigm of any other region or period. The point is that redirecting our analytical and conceptual gaze will help us to recognize as integral to the meaningful conceptualization of Islam features and elements that, by focusing on other regions and periods, we have grown accustomed to marginalize and ignore. Then, I'm sure those of you who read the book know and are interested in how he moves to discussing the difference between his conceptualization of the B2B complex and what's been called the Perso-Turkic or Persianate cultural realm, which he finds, in those usages, he finds assumptively privileging linguistic and ethnic elements, and that they highlight and suggest Persian as the constitutive and definitive genius of the shared Islamic paradigm of the B2B historical space. These points, like the discussion we already had about his objections to the term Islamicate and how some of us here, full of admiration of his book, may still find some uses in it. This point about the offering of the B2B complex as an alternative to the term Persianate will, and I'm sure will continue to be debated. And I am not sure if these need to be mutually exclusive perspectives, as we just saw with respect to Islam and Islamicate. I think many of us are going to continue to use Persianate when it makes sense to identify that particularly Persian element that we see, for whatever purpose that is in our hands at the moment studying that world. We may find the term Persianate appropriate, and then we may switch to B2B complex, and I don't think these will live necessarily in some kind of antagonism, though it will take time to sort them out, to negotiate them, to give them their own analytical semantic sphere. But there is no doubt in my mind that the ocular shift that Shahab is proposing, the ocular shift Shahab is proposing is rewarding in a singular way through the maintenance of the terms Islam and Islamic, since that enables one to engage with the presumed and prevailing centrality of medieval Islamic history as the Islamic history, and to assert the authenticity of the Muslims of post-formative era and non-central places of Islam, if you take the Middle East as that sector. The next issue that he considers is about the elites versus the rest of Islamic society, and that I'm going to skip for now, but I would be happy to answer. Shahab does not often venture into social history in this book, but he was a very good reader of it, and it's very clear in that brief discussion of why one should not consider his argument to be limited to the elites only. Those very few pages give a very good sense of Shahab's consideration of what others of us would call social history, which is not necessarily a big part of his concerns. Already, many people are struck by the power of this conceptualization, B2B complex, and wish to be included in it. B2B is, for all practical purposes, now the happening place. Over dinner the other day, I heard from a friend that an Indonesian friend of his who read the book asked, why are we not included? Why does it start in Bengal? The question was asked with a great deal of admiration for the paradigm, questioning its geographic delimitations, yes, but only after recognizing its eye-opening and emancipatory possibilities recognizing the eye-opening and emancipatory possibilities of its impressive conceptual leap. It is not only a powerful conceptualization or spatialization, respatialization I should add, but it is also empowering in a world where one of the best-selling books by a Nobel-winning writer presents his experiences among the believers as being among mostly inauthentic peoples. The word authentic comes in and out of Shahab's book, in not very often, but in very critical passages. Of course, the geographic delimitations of B2B will be debated and deserve to be debated and renegotiated and may be stretched. But that should be done without disregarding the capaciousness, I would even say generosity of mind in which Shahab presents all this. His Bengal, I would like to think, already looks towards Southeast Asia. There might be more of a problem with Maghreb and the Arab world, but those two he addresses, whether one is convinced or not, and those two will continue to be debated and negotiated in terms of the relevance of B2B complex. But when I speak about the relevance here, I'm not really speaking about the overall relevance. I'm simply speaking about the delimitations, the need to stretch it here or there to include a bit more. But whatever else we do with it, it is already here to stay, as I have already indicated. And I think to the historians, that is the most, at least in terms of the future of research, that is going to be the most productive avenue of inquiry and analysis and proposition offered by Shahab. In any case, it is not presented at the expense of any other region or period. Neither is it the case that the Balkans to Bengal complex is so peculiar or unique as to be schematically unrepresentative or inapplicable of anything other than its very large and protracted self. And he proposes that once we have reconceptualized Islam in a manner and mode that accounts for the normativities of the B2B complex, it will be possible to turn back into other periods and other regions and to view them in a new light and with the benefit of a new perspective, which will enable us to see things that we have been unable to see before. Now, I want to give a much smaller example to indicate the significance to me and the boldness of the move he makes in questioning the paradigm of Islamic history and in raising all kinds of new possibilities for those fields, especially that treat the so-called B2B complex in that late medieval, early modern period. And that has to do with the famous Gaza debate, which is one of the most important debates for those of you studying or interested in early Ottoman history. Did the Ottoman state establish itself on the basis of the spirit of Gaza? Since the 1930s, when this theory was advanced, or Gaza, or let us say, warfare and struggle for the faith in the frontiers of Islam. It is not to be confused with the notion of jihad, though there are obvious parallels and similarities. In any case, in the 1930s, Paul Wittek, a Viennese scholar, proposed that the very significant rise of the Ottoman state in the 14th and 15th centuries into a world empire from very humble, very, very modest beginnings could be explained by the fact that they considered themselves engaged in Gaza and considered themselves as Ghazis, warriors in the name of the faith. For a long while, this was the reigning paradigm in explaining the rise of the Ottoman state until in the 1980s, several scholars in Europe and America questioned it from the point of view of its Islamicity, so to speak. They looked at the behavior of these Ghazis and they observed that there are stories sometimes of wine drinking among them. You could maybe write off those stories, but there are several stories in which they are close friends with the Christians and engage in raids with the Christians as friends and buddies and co-warriors, and then discuss how the booty should be distributed among them. There are various instances in which they engage in practices that do not seem quite correct from the Islamic point of view, such as the famous prince, Süleyman Pasha, who was one of the first to move into Thrace and eventually usher the period of Ottoman conquests in the Balkans. He fell victim during a hunting expedition, actually, not during a raid or anything, and his horse, Sorry?
It's just a computer.
It was Siri, the iPhone.
It was just
Oh, the iPhone. Anyway, Süleyman Pasha, the Ottoman prince, asked for his horse to be buried right next to him. Shamanists. Immediately, of course, those scholars who were debating the Gaza theory, found that these fellows cannot have been fighting in the name of their faith. These fellows who wanted to be buried right next to their horse, these fellows who had Christians among them, etc., etc. In any case, eventually, the counter-argument to that, developed by many of us, including myself, was that we should allow these Ghazis to be fighting in the name of Islam in the way they understood Islam. Whatever Islam was to them, however they presented their struggle for the faith and how they understood the faith, they should be allowed to be called with that identity. Not a fan of monocausal explanations. I do not think, by the way, this is any explanation for the rise of the Ottoman state, but still, I was interested in the cultural, social, and religious phenomena that prevailed in those circles and tried to understand them. It's not necessarily a matter of explaining the rise of the Ottomans by Gaza. In any case, they should be allowed to be Muslims according to their own hearts and minds, was the argument, the short of it. But does this mean Islam is what, or whatever Muslims say it is, which is one of the now prevailing, a relatively latitudinarian, if I may call it that, attitude that wants to move away from the normative descriptions of Islam and wants to now define Islam through whatever Muslims say it is. Not quite. And on that, Shahab has made the most eloquent and the most convincing arguments. He says there is something peculiar and particular to Islamic deliberation that renders it Islamic. It is not just anything that anyone does in the name of or in one's own self-identification as Muslim. This point takes him to chapter 5, namely the one on hermeneutical engagement, which I think is his magisterial chapter, where he focuses on the myriad varieties and seemingly infinite possibilities of meaning-making by and for Muslims, communally or individually, as well as the structures and disciplines, not necessarily learned and not necessarily prescriptive, as well as the structures and disciplines within which such meaning takes place. There is pretext, text, and context before we can say Islam is what or whatever Muslims say or do it is. To paraphrase Marx, Muslims make their own Islam, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. This is sort of a mantra for historians. Even if one is Marxist or not, the 18th Brumaire is the greatest text, and obviously it fits my purposes very well in trying to understand what Shahab is doing. Now, when I have such thoughts, and many others that I have no time to share with you here, I say to myself, oh, how I wish I could have that discussion with him, with Shahab. And I always imagine that scene outdoors. The stairs in front of Widener, a walk by the river, driving to Darbar, his favorite restaurant, and lowering the car windows to enjoy the spring view better, even though it's still very chilly out. For such bookish people who liked so much to talk about books, this may sound paradoxical. But the visual archive of the B2B complex that, as I will show you now, suggests otherwise. I had no other opportunity to make any comments at the personal level about my dear and dearly departed friend Shahab, and allow me just 5 minutes for some more personal observations. But through the visual archive of the B2B complex, which is all about books and outdoors. You know? Now, surprisingly, I was for a totally different kind of research. I was looking into the history of reading, and I saw one or two of these miniature depictions of Ottomans reading. And I was struck by the fact that overwhelmingly they take place outdoors. And then I looked around at the Safavid and Mughal realms. Lo and behold, in the 16th and 17th centuries in particular, most of the scholars, most of the scholarly engagement, but not only scholarly engagement with books, is depicted to have taken place outdoors. I'll just run through very quickly. I thought I want to comment at length. Even when they're indoors, there's always a good hint of the outdoors. It may not be very clear in this picture, but behind the grilled window, you see the greenery. This is the famous astronomer, and he's, again, outdoors, Taqiyuddin of the 1570s. Someone will know. I'll skip that. What's happening? That was the big, this is the detail from that one. Detail from that one. Here you see it in the right direction, the other one was upside down or sideways. This is the one. This is the most fun scene of reading that I've seen anywhere, where everybody's enjoying the spring, everybody's playing games. And books are part of that scene. This is one of Shahab's favorites, of course. Molla Hünkar Mevlana Celaleddin Rumi is depicted in the 17th century. Outdoors, outdoors, Safavid. And Babur, of course. We're getting close to Shahab's own South Asia. And may the best reading corner and the best books of that garden library be with you forever.
Okay.
Well, I'm glad Cemal showed pictures, because you might have expected perhaps that I will show many slides, which I will not, and so he compensated for my decision not to use images, but to engage directly with the argument of Shahab's groundbreaking book, and my task will be to analyze how it speaks to art history, but also specifically to Islamic art history. I would, oops, sorry, back. Back.
Oops, that's fitting. Sorry, no, go for it.
Sorry for going, sorry. This desk is, has a life of its own.
Maybe go for it.
I will begin with some personal remembrances, maybe because I didn't know Shahab well, unlike the previous speakers. In fact, I began to interact with him only in 2014. Of course, I knew him, his eloquent comments from conferences, and we always said hello to each other, but we never spoke. So I very much regret that after having read his wonderful book. The way I began to interact with him was when Jamal and I invited him to participate in a workshop we co-organized at Harvard in 2014. And at one of the dinners, I found out, to my huge surprise, that Shahab not only harbored a passionate interest in art history, but also was writing a critique about current modes of thinking about the Islamicness of Islamic art in his forthcoming book. I was really relieved when he, when he expressed appreciation of my work, and not being, I must say, not being quoted in his book shows an appreciation, because he has a tendency to only say negative things, which because of the main argument. He said that he would very much like to have a conversation about his views and thoughts on art, and I regret not having had this opportunity because we were just going on sabbatical or something, and it just was not possible. In our workshop, we asked, Shahab presented a brilliant lecture focused on a recently discovered inventory of books kept in the Ottoman Palace Library, which was commissioned in 1502 by Sultan Bayezid II's librarian, by Sultan Bayezid II to his librarian. And I was working on the library, which was also the Imperial Treasury, and asked Andras Riedelmeier, who's the Aga Khan program librarian, to perhaps get a microfilm of this, and it turned out to be such a huge collection of over 365 pages that we decided with Jamal to have a separate project. So this document lists approximately 5,700 volumes and 7,200 titles in all branches of knowledge one can think of, with titles in Arabic, by far the most, about 80%, Persian, very little Ottoman Turkish, and a tiny bit of what is called Mongolia, but it is, you can tell from the titles, Chagatai Turkish. These books represented precisely the cultural mix that fascinated Shahab, and which he analyzed in his book, which was at that point being written. In a meeting we had later on in my office, after the workshop, we discussed the contrast between the syllabus of the Ottoman madrasa, which he had just written an article on from the period of Süleyman, and how much more wide-ranging the book collection of the palace was, which was partly catered to the prince's education as well as the top-level administrators. So this library therefore showed their mental and religious universe and everything else. I remember how amazed Shahab was on that occasion when he wanted to see the books on literature and poetry, and he stressed that this collection by far surpassed his expectations. His book not only stresses the polyphonic character of the trilingual Ottomans, but also the requirement of 17th century Mughal gentlemen to know the same three languages plus Hindi that later on became Urdu. Shahab concludes that these court cultures are most meaningfully conceptualized not ethnically as Persianate, Turkic, or Perso-Turkic, but rather as Islamic. Interestingly, his book cites the Ottoman Palace Library inventory several times. For example, when he discusses the presence of 6 copies of the late 15th century philosopher Jalaluddin Davani, who had just written his works, immediately consumed and collected, on a treatise on ethics and politics titled Ahlaki Jalali, along with copies of Nasruddin Tusi's Ahlaki Nasiri, which were very widely read in the B&B complex, but that goes too much bed and breakfast, so I would prefer not to I will call it Balkans to Bengal complex. Shahab also found concrete information in the inventory for his ideas on cultural pluralism and the accommodation of contradiction in different registers of hierarchically ordered knowledge. In fact, theological and legal sources coexist side by side in this inventory, in which all the sciences and areas of knowledge are classified encyclopedically, but according to a clear hierarchy, with the Quran coming first, Islam, the fiqh, etc. So it has a very strong collection of Islamic humanities, ranging from philosophy and history to ethics, politics, Sufism, literature, geography, and the mathematical sciences in that order. In our workshop, we asked Shahab to discuss books on tafsir, namely Quranic exegesis and the science of Quranic recitation, since each of the lectures evaluated the contents of the Ottoman Palace Library in the specific disciplines in which they had been catalogued. Shahab's superb lecture not only appraised what was collected and what was missing from the library, but also presented a sophisticated analysis of religious culture at the turn of the 16th century. This was a vivid demonstration of the breadth of his erudition, displaying the broad horizons of his conceptualization of the interrelatedness of religion, culture, and history. We deeply regret that Shahab is not around to contribute to our edited book on this primary source, but we were particularly honored that he was at the very final stages of his project, an Aga Khan Program postdoctoral associate at Harvard's History of Art and Architecture department. I find it very meaningful that one of his advanced graduate students, Mohsin Gozarzi, has agreed to write an essay for our volume on the subject of Shahab's lecture, in grateful memory of his mentor. So now I turn to my thoughts on Shahab's book from the lens of art history. As the title declares, this monumental work is primarily about Islam and the importance of being Islamic. The visual arts play a very significant, though relatively brief, role in its main argument, focusing primarily on manuscript painting, calligraphy, and figural representations on coins and objects that bear inscriptions. Shahab emphasizes particularly text and image relations. Therefore, his book does not deal that much with architectural culture, spatiality, and urbanism. The selectiveness of Shahab's treatment of Islamic art to the near exclusion of the built environment, I believe, has to do with the specific role he assigns to art in the broader argument of his book. To put it differently, his goal is not to provide an all-encompassing portrayal of the arts of Islam, nor a new art historical methodology, but rather to demonstrate how Islamic art proves the main question of his book, namely, what is Islam, the importance of being Islamic. Different disciplines play their assigned parts in the polyphonic orchestration of this major question, which is repeated as a leitmotif throughout the book. The figural arts are coupled with wine drinking, which follows immediately after Shahab's discussion of visual arts in the last chapter, which is chapter 6. Both serve to prove that these supposedly forbidden practices are in fact Islamic, according to Shahab's definition. The book cites the opposition to figural images by the proponents of the main legal schools of Islam. Yet it is correctly noted that the Balkan to Bengal complex remained surprisingly tolerant toward figural representation. This paradox demonstrates the contrast between coexisting legal and non-legal discourses, which play an important role in making the point of his book. The same observation applies to the question of wine. This was not just a matter of tolerance, but actually involved the positive valorization of wine consumption and figural painting, which is a very important point to make, because usually one brushes it over with tolerance. Indeed, one can find many examples in which not only is wine drinking a positive mental exercise for Sufis and so on, but also painting can lead one into higher levels of abstract thinking, as many rulers such as Akbar and others were constantly doing. These two practices quintessentially demonstrate the stated goal of the book, namely constructing a new language of conceptualization of Islam in which the logic of internal contradiction replaces the stereotypical notion of unity in variety. A jade cup of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir combining a poem on wine and Islamic texts is a very powerful case in point. Even more so is the illustration, which we kind of see on the book Dust Jacket, which is a coin, a gold coin struck by Jahangir in 1611 to commemorate the 6th year of his accession. It depicts him as he holds a wine glass in one hand and a book on the other, and he asks rightly, which book is this? Maybe the Quran, thereby representing him as legitimate ruler. With oratorical tour de force, Shahab asks, quote, clearly, for Jahangir, his wine cup cohered with his conceptualization of what is Islam. Does our own conceptualization of Islam allow us to understand this coherence? Shahab's conceptualization of Islam in terms of coherent contradiction rather than unity in diversity is very exciting. In a critical essay on the historiography of Islamic art that I wrote, I've expressed a similar discontent with the wishy-washy notion of unity in diversity or diversity in unity, which has pervaded the field of Islamic art since its inception. My essay, titled The Concept of Islamic Art, Inherited Discourses and New Approaches, proposed a remedy that is somewhat different from Shahab's, which understandably derives from his perspective rooted in Islamic studies and intellectual history. But the points of view are completely complementary. As a historian of Islamic art and architecture, I argued that what my field needs is clearer subdivisions in terms of time and space, within which configurations of regions and polities continually shifted. The aim of this new periodization and spatialization was to remap the field to counteract the tenacity of ahistorical and essentialist approaches to Islamic art since the 19th century. At that time, the medieval period in the heartland of the Fertile Crescent was posited as a classical moment when the norms of typically Islamic art supposedly became fixed in the 9th century, roughly kind of Abbasid, and anything that happened thereafter and in different geographies was seen as not belonging to the golden age of Islamic civilization, and the outlying regions such as the Balkans and the Indian subcontinent were viewed and often continue to be viewed as less original and not typically Islamic derivatives of formerly established prototypes. In that respect, I find the perspective of Shahab's book complementary to my goals in that historiographical essay, but also because he focuses specifically on the Balkans to Bengal complex on which I'm finishing a book myself, on a topic when I'm going on sabbatical, and as I finalize this book, which is based on the Slade lectures that I gave in the other Cambridge in 2013, it's called Transregional Connections, Architecture and the Construction of Early Modern Islamic Empires. So I've been teaching this course since '87, and at that time was inspired by Marshall Hodgson's venture to Islam, who was the first to conceptualize the region as from the Balkans to Bengal, as having been partitioned in the early modern period by 3 major empires and their satellites. Shahab's book too focuses on this space-time zone as a case study, but gives it a new twist, as we have seen in, so I won't repeat those observations. He says that it is not meant to delegitimize the Perso-Turkic or Persianate world of Hodgson. A positive contribution of Shahab's book to art history is that it firmly locates the Balkan to Bengal complex within the mainstream of Islam. By contrast, general surveys of Islamic art and architecture have accepted the existence of an Islamic art until 1250, and after the Mongols, going to your question, not thereafter, when it becomes difficult to talk about a single Islamic art. Since I find it rather questionable that a single unified Islamic art existed in any given period, analyzing the successive processes of the formation of Islamic art over the ages seems preferable to me. The Balkan to Bengal complex is one of these stages of formation. If we conceptualize Islamic art as an ongoing formative process that is still going on. It is fair to say, however, that Shahab's book is not concerned with understanding the internal and external dynamics of such developmental historical processes of art. Those processes were often underpinned by cultural politics and rival dynasties and polities, as well as the agencies of artists, inherited local traditions that informed the creation of distinctive idioms. The terms polity, politics, and patronage are almost absent in Shahab's book, in favor of portraying an abstracted notion of Islam extending from Balkans all the way to Bengal. So, in a way, I would say that he does not deal with the active participation of this region in the 16th century age of confessionalization of empires, particularly territorial empires from Europe throughout the Islamic East. The regimes of acceptability and the limits of tolerance were highly contested as new territorial borders were being carved out. This resulted in intermittent warfare between polities that were often couched in sectarian religious terms. Clear distinctions of attitude emerged in these early modern polities about the permissibility of allowing figural images and wine consumption in public realms, even though it may be okay and certainly accommodated in private domains. Even within the same polity, the limits of permissibility were not one and the same. For instance, Jahangir's coins depicting with a wine cup were not emulated by his more circumspect and son and successor Shah Jahan, while the next ruler, Aurangzeb, even removed Islamic inscriptions from coinage, given that coins would be handled by non-Muslims. In my interpretation, these well-known factors and the public versus private dichotomy are evaded in Shahab's book because he is mainly concerned with practices contradicting dominant Islamic legal discourses, which some scholars have mistakenly privileged as normative. And we have clearly seen that he does that quite brilliantly. This is why he focuses on figural images on paper and on objects in the first place, rather than on Friday mosques or Quran manuscripts, where obviously stricter codes of legal codes and norms of decorum were observed. In doing so, Shahab powerfully achieves his goal of demonstrating the contrast between legal and non-legal discourses that coexisted in what he calls coherent contradiction. The book effectively highlights the plurality of norms and the proponents of those norms who were arguing and disputing over what is Islamic. However, the historical details of those arguments and disputes do not concern Shahab. It might well be argued by some readers that his book, by marginalizing the religious dynamics of cultural politics within the domains of dominant polities, Shahab is being equally selective as the scholars he criticizes for focusing only on the law. But I believe this is not necessarily a legitimate argument, given the very clearly stated goals, almost legalistically, in the introduction of his book, which others and I have discussed earlier. Shahab is clearly less interested in how dynamics of cultural politics impacted art production or art consumption. He is more interested in hermeneutic engagement with individual paintings and portable objects, a kind of one-to-one engagement. And it's almost like a deep reading of the individual objects, which fits his definition of Islam. In other words, he is much more concerned with a close reading of specific artworks than with aspects of materiality, art making, authorship, reception, which are equally valid concerns for art historians. Shahab's primary aim in the book is demonstrating that one cannot separate religion from culture, and he successfully achieves this goal. If I understand correctly, there is also a strong implication in his book that the Muslim subject has a higher capacity of deeper hermeneutic engagement with Islamic art and meaning-making through art than non-Muslim subjects, and this could be somewhat problematic. Even though he does not exclude the later group, Shahab clearly privileges panemic definitions of Islam on page 106. That is, definitions from the perspective of the insider subject, rather than ethic ones from the perspective of the outside observer. To return to Shahab's position within the emic versus ethic debate, he explicitly invites his readers to what he calls Islamic hermeneutics, which is a very strong chapter, I agree with Jamal. That is, projects productive of meaning in terms of Islam. So he emphasizes that Islam is a universal community, even if imagined in the self-perception of Muslims who share a sense of universal human solidarity across time and space. Islam is defined by him as the hermeneutic engagement by an actor with a source or object, which could be also art, that produces meaning for the actor, whether he is Muslim or non-Muslim. The basic question then for him to ask is, what meaning is added by qualifying that phenomenon or object by the word Islamic? And obversely, how does not using the term Islamic deplete or distort the constitution of the phenomenon or object or statement? End quote. So he also recommends us to ask, What is Islamic about the poetry of Hafiz? What is Islamic about Islamic art? What is Islamic about wine drinking? Shahab asks that these questions cease to be a problem, cease to be a problem at all when one recognizes the logic of internal contradiction. And asking what is Islamic about Islamic art certainly makes a lot of sense from the perspective of Islamic studies and other disciplines, and hopefully Shahab's book will help create new positions in centers of Islamic studies for historians of Islamic art who are currently almost all appointed in history of art history departments. So it shows something about Islamic studies that Shahab is really kind of has pinpointed. However, it is also true that the same question can be asked about what is Christian about early modern art of Christian Europe, which is very legitimate. But this question does not necessarily exhaust the types of issues art historians of the Renaissance or Baroque, which is the period he deals with in the Islamic world, would be interested in exploring. Likewise, from the point of view of an Islamic art historian, assessing the multiple agencies involved in negotiating what became artistically acceptable or not in a given context might be equally appealing questions. Given the importance of human and historical Islam for Shahab, it matters how we use Islamic to characterize certain phenomena. Ironically, the term Islamic art was largely a Western invention that he fully embraces in his book, although his definition of Islam is certainly different and much broader than its standard range of meanings. Shahab is highly critical of critiques of the term Islamic art, a term that some art historians have not been entirely satisfied with. And it's actually quite a raging debate. I must admit that I do not understand why he so insistently opposes Hodgson's term, Islamicate, which does fulfill an important function. And I believe it can very comfortably coexist side by side with Islamic, just like the widely used term Persianate, which I will continue to use, I'm afraid. For instance, I cannot bring myself to agree with Shahab's criticism of Hodgson, who terms the great Jewish figure Maimonides not an Islamic intellectual, but an Islamicate one. According to Shahab, if Jews are making Judaism meaningful for themselves in terms of Islam, why not call it Islamic Jewish thought? I would say Maimonides himself would be the first not to accept that definition. Moreover, by the same token, early Islam, which largely defined itself in terms of context of Christianity and Judaism, should not be called Islamic, as some have actually argued. Here, taking into consideration an emic perspective of self-definition might prove useful. Let me give an art historical example. I do not deem it reasonable to call the Arabizing palatial monuments of Norman Palermo as samples of Arab or Islamic architecture, as many books do. Islamicate Norman architecture seems to me a better label for these monuments. Likewise, I do not refer to the Mukarnas domes and portals of Armenian churches in Anatolia as Islamic, but instead as examples of Armenian architecture with Islamicate features. My terminological preference in both instances has to do with questions of self-definition and agency. I'm not saying that this has to be the only definition, but it's the kind of argument that I'm sure others will probably make. If the patronage context of a building or an object falls within a non-Islamic religio-cultural sphere, I do not call it Islamic. even when it closely engages with Islamic prototypes. I'm afraid if we do not make such a distinction, one would have to call the Umayyad Dome of the Rock a Christian or Byzantine monument, as did some 19th century European observers. So there are some reasons, I think, why the term Islamicate was invented, and it hasn't really been widely used. It's only recently that more and more Islamic art historians find it a useful category. So now I'm coming to the final part of my discussion. So the question is, why does Shahab insist so inflexibly on the labels Islam and Islamic, which was asked before? I think his insistence has to do with the broader agenda of his book, which once again becomes apparent in the brief concluding section titled The Importance of Being Islamic. Here he writes, quote, "Conceptualizing Islam as meaning-making for the self in terms of pretext, text, and context also enables us to recognize that all acts and statements of meaning-making for the self by Muslims and non-Muslims that are carried out in terms of Islam should properly be understood as Islamic. To do otherwise is to impoverish and distort the meaning of those acts and statements." End quote. Indeed, Shahab's primary goal is, in his words, quote, "to bring into definition Islam in its plenitude of meaning and meaning-making for the self by 1/5 of humanity." The valuable humanitarian message of the last sentence of his book, addressing both Muslims and non-Muslims, reads, quote, "Let us understand, apprehend, and benefit from the importance of being Islamic." In brief, Shahab Ahmed's timely book commendably challenges current modes of thinking about Islam and the Islamic, thereby generating questions that will surely provoke lively debate among future generations. Quoting the historian of Islamic art Wendy Shaw, who sees the need to revise the distinction between culture and religion, Shahab proposes a more radical reconsideration of those two categories altogether. He declares that we need to move beyond the distinction between religion and culture to constitute the relevant category, that of Islam. His thoughtful observations on the visual arts are important in their implications for Islamic art history, but even more so for the central position he assigns to art within the broader constellation of disciplines that constitute Islam and the Islamic. Shahab writes, quote, "Statements of Islamic meaning arise not merely from the discourses of law, hadith, Quranic exegesis, theology, Sufism, philosophy, and history, but also from those preeminent registers of meaning-making and self-expression, which include the imaginative and fictional discourses of poetics, narrative, music, and art." End quote. To conclude, although art comes last in the list, as it normally does, Shahab's book forcefully establishes the importance of Islamic art for Islam and for the importance of being Islamic.
Now I'll invite you both here. How often do you guys get to sit next to each other on stage?
Rarely.
I can't remember one.
We're 15 minutes. No, we're just, I know we're about that. Come on, go sit. Do the break now?
No.
Oh, do the Q&A now. Okay, so we're going to do Q&A now. I know we're 15 minutes behind. That's okay. That's by design. I want everyone to know what they're saying. So we're going to do a quick Q&A and then have coffee break. So questions, hopefully some answers.
Thank you, Gulru and Jamal. It was really great to hear your personal reflections as well. The question is for Gulru primarily. So I think of the example that Shahab gives about the Sikh wrestler who, before getting into the ring, says, Ya Ali, as a way of making meaning in sense of Islam, and he calls that an Islamic one. And the analogous case for me in thinking about Maimonides as an Islamic thinker would be myself as somebody who would be a Muslim American thinker, since I'm American and I'm here. So Maimonides would be a Jewish Islamic thinker, that Islam for him is really very much like a style of thinking, an ambiance, a cultural way. I've been trained here in the West. So in that way, it doesn't translate to the Muqarnas exactly. So am I missing something there? The Muqarnas doesn't seem to address this concern that Shahab is addressing.
I think, though, we were discussing this in a different context with Noah, that, I think, especially if Maimonides is writing about Judaism and he wouldn't consider himself, a Sikh person is different because they engage in a different way. So I would say that it has to be a case-by-case analysis, rather than, as Shahab seems to say, that all cases are like that. And I think that there he became very legalistic and almost made it incumbent on everyone to accept this definition. So yes, but I gave the Muqarnas not because it is similar, but because it is an art historical example where my point was not to argue against his point, but to show that for art history, especially because we deal with concrete objects, you have to define what these objects are. Otherwise, everything can become a huge blob of things, which is why I feel separating time and zones of space is very important, because otherwise you return to the 19th century conception of Islamic art, which is all sort of undifferentiated and essentialist. So this was the reason. But I think if that Sikh person says, Ya Ali, maybe he's engaging in some way with Ali, but would he consider himself Islamic is something that I would like to interview him for.
Noah.
I just wanted to say about exactly this point. What's interesting about those examples, what they have in common, Guru's examples, is that they're religious examples of another religion, of a person who denies being a Muslim. So Maimonides is busy polemicizing against Islam, even though of course he can't think outside of the categories that Islam creates, and they influence him. So what's sort of interesting is, this goes back to our discussion of the anthropological earlier, arguably a Shahab-style argument against this point of Shahab's is to say that when the person himself or herself would say, not only am I not a Muslim, I am against Islam. At that point, it maybe becomes problematic to say to the person, well, you really are Islamic, whether you think so or not. That's not a very Shahabian kind of point. On the other hand, every time it is a Muslim who is saying, yes, I think what I'm doing is Islamic, that seems like it should provide a powerful argument for characterizing as Islamic rather than Islamic hate. And notice that that's different than Persianate. Because Persianate, it's its own very complicated story, but there the Persianate cultures are self-consciously borrowing Persian language and Persian artistic, formulations and some Persian literary formulations, but they have no stake in calling themselves Persians. Typically, and that's different than Islam, because the term Persian, at least in that context, isn't that normative. That changes later on.
But I would say nobody would call Islamic art Islamicate. It's only in the outlying regions that it is used as such. And in fact, it's a field where nobody has gotten rid of the term Islamic art. Everyone calls it Islamic art. So the Metropolitan Museum example is a very strange list that also doesn't include every geography, and many people make fun of it. So it's not it's not really adopted by any serious art historian I can think of. So thank you.
Arafat.
Professor Gafadar, I have a question about periodization, of course, as historians. In some ways, the early modern is also the happening time, so to speak.
Yes.
In many ways.
Yes.
And as it happens, Shahab deals with precisely, I think, that period that in European terms is seen as the early modern.
Yes.
But for him, this is in some ways a history of pre-modern Islam. So my question really is, in what ways does his account perhaps challenge us to rethink periods in a different way? I mean, of course, in Islamic history, the European periodization doesn't really work to begin with. But I was just curious for your thoughts.
When he offers dates, he generally gives 1350 to 1850, which is early modern plus. Late medieval and early modern, but of course moving into the 19th century. So it doesn't exactly overlap with those, but I don't think he does. He has given this much thought. I really wish, actually, I looked for, again and again, I looked at his index for modernity, and there's more than just what is indicated in the index, what his discussion, what his notion of modernity is, so that we could perhaps elaborate on the uses of early modern or the need to discard it or whatever. I don't think, as it is in the book, there's enough meat to get into that discussion, though one could, by implication, obviously read things into it. He often calls it post-formative period, right? That is the term he uses, which is more of a default category than an actual characterization of a period, like pre-modern. Pre-modern, post-formative are very useful. So I think post-formative is perhaps, given maybe that Shahab did not necessarily the way, I mean, if he really wanted to think about early modern and its uses, he would probably have given it many months, you know, he would have gone through many stacks in the library and then formulated and reformulated all this before he would put it in the book. I think he just doesn't. He's not engaged in that discussion, though perhaps we should take it to that level, but yeah.
Question? Okay, then we will break for coffee. I have a coffee break slide.
Yes.